Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And Zach, just delightful to see you again. I do have 5 questions, Zach, and they are rapid fire questions. And you know, the beauty in the questions I'm going to ask you is that they're incredibly reductive and stupid questions. And I can't think of a more intelligent, a profoundly intelligent man to answer the most reductive and stupid questions that actually need to be asked, so that people get real coherence and understanding, because we've become so sophisticated and so clever in our ignorance. And you know, to the extent that we have billions of people staggering around the streets with masks on their faces and doing what totalitarian auto diktats are coming from governments and from councils and from municipal authorities and from health administrators, and people have departed from reason in the main, which is to say that they've departed from their own conscience and are absent in consciousness. So I think it takes an incredibly clever and beautiful soul, such as yourself, to be able to answer the most reductive questions. So I'm going to ask them unashamedly. What is a virus?
The virus is a communication network of genomics, and it's the most important building block for life on Earth. And so we have vilified the very mechanism by which biology has happened on the planet. And this is a tragic mistake for science. I you know, certainly for humanity and for economics, it's been tragedy. But I have a deeper concern for science itself, that we have allowed, as scientists and physicians, the demonization of nature. And that is a really sad thing. We are given such an honorable position to be able to be witness to nature with the most powerful tools ever developed: microscopes, telescopes, genomic sequencers. I mean, we are getting a glimpse into the very depths of how life has occurred, not just on the planet, but within the universe, and how biophotonics and physics actually produces the building blocks for biology to occur on a planet, and how that planet can then emerge with this bioactive, always regenerative, always eager to communicate, always eager to create more bounty and more biodiversity. And that life is what we have vilified by trying to convince ourselves and each other that these viruses are attacking us. It is very important for us to all just consider that viruses are not living beings. They are not like bacteria and fungi and protozoa and archaea. Viruses are packages of information that are secreted by living organisms. They also are, you know, very simple arrangements of physical structures, amino acid type building blocks that will go on to build those amino acid proteins and all of that. And so they are a template for life to develop, and they never have enough information within a single virus to do something to a human. They can participate in many different, you know, pathways in human biology, but there's not enough genetic information in a single virus to do something horrific to mankind. If that was the case, of course, a virus would have killed all of us long ago. Viruses, though, are integrated into our biology, and we get to decide which viruses we turn on and reproduce and which ones we don't. And so it's the train within the cell. We now know that genetic, you know, engines or machinery that will determine which genes get turned on within our genome, which viruses will enter and be transcribed into, you know, DNA within our genome, or, you know, reproduced in the cytoplasm and secreted out to the world again. Highly controlled mechanisms by which we do this. And so this is not like some accident. It's not like some, you know, infection that can take over all of our machinery. The RNA is a very passive, you know, situation with this coronavirus. It's a very passive gene that moves into the environment of our cell, and then we can either reproduce that or not. And as we've seen with this situation with corona, is the vast majority of people are taking this genetic update and have no symptoms to that. And so this is a genetic update to our species that's expressing an adaptation to the stress that we've induced on the planet.
Beautiful. Thank you. Absolutely beautiful. The next question is also a fairly obvious one. Is given that the virus is an excretion or an exosome, It's not something which is able to leap from one human to another, presumably. So the idea of 2 meters social distancing and wearing a mask that costs you 20 cents. I mean, how absurd is that theater?
It would make sense if the particles that we breathe, so these respiratory particles that they keep telling us about that can travel 3 or 6 feet, if that's the only way viruses travel, then that would make some sense, because viruses are, once we go into a production phase of a virus, meaning that we have decided that we're going to reproduce this thing. And so we need to make this thing, this adaptation needs to be spread throughout our body and throughout, you know, the environment around us to help proliferate this update. And so we're giving this genetic update to the environment. Once we start into that process, we make that into a smart delivery system. And so we will wrap it in the correct receptors to get that to the right position within another cell in our body or to another, you know, external target. And in the case of coronavirus, it tags a receptor called the ACE2 receptor in our lungs, vascular tree, and the rest, so that it gets to the right cells to get the right genetic information into those cells. And so it's a very intelligent distribution. It's not just like random, like spewing of genetic information and it just goes out there to infect whatever it touches. It needs to have an intelligent, design behind it as to where that's going to end up. But as it turns out, we know very well that viruses were proliferating around the whole globe long before an animal ever breathed. And so these were building the fabric of life from fungi and plants and everything else. The viruses were slowly building the complexity and diversity within the genetic code of the planet. And humans, for example, mammals as a whole, 50% of our genome was built directly by a virus insertion. So a virus inserted a piece of DNA or an RNA got reverse transcribed into DNA within our genome, and we kept that as an important update. These are critical. We now know that without retroviruses, for example, like HIV, that all these retroviruses account for about 10% of our genome. And our genes that are updated by retroviruses or given to us by retroviruses allow us to do the very things that allow for resilience and regenerative capacity within our body. Stem cells actually can't be a stem cell without the gene from a retrovirus that was inserted a couple million years ago in the mammalian code. And same thing with a placenta, in fact, which gets really interesting. We could not have a placenta without the viral genomics that we adopted from the environment. And so we would not have had the first mammalian birth without the intelligence of the virome building that intelligence. And so we are, again, vilifying the very fabric by which life was built. And by vilifying that, it leads to all kinds of ridiculous mistakes in the public health sector. And so to think that we should mask our way away from viruses is erroneous on many, many levels. Number one, respiratory droplets that are being stopped by that is only one mechanism by which viruses spread. Again, they spread all over the world through aerosols, these airborne rather than waterborne respiratory droplets. Airborne tagged to things like dust particles, carbon in the atmosphere can tag the virus, and it can carry around the globe. And so there's nice studies out of Europe showing that when a virus is discovered in humans, you can then go up into ice caps and other desert environments of Europe and find the same viruses showing up at the same time. And so it doesn't take human travel. It doesn't take airplanes to move viruses around. Viruses were moving around the earth for billions of years. They wasn't waiting for humans to invent the airplane. And so this CDC kind of model of, oh, this plane flew from here to there, sure, that can cause that infection in that individual, but if you just waited 3 weeks, that virus was going to coat the surface of the planet anyways, and so it's this perception that's always so narcissistic. We're so human centric in our worldview, and we try to make biology fit to us as if we're the machines that are moving it, and we're the machines that are distributing it, and therefore we need to be blocked. That virus is for the planet. That coronavirus was updated to all mammals on the planet. It wasn't just for humans. All mammals have the ability to absorb that virus. And then everybody's like, well, they're not getting sick. Well, of course not, because they don't have the cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and everything else that we have. And so we were dying from our morbidity, mortality, and our messed up biology from our toxicity. And so this virus that spread around the world didn't cause massive death and in other, large cats in the jungles or whatever it is. The ACE2 receptor is abundant within all mammals, and yet we don't see the same disease pattern.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And so that goes some way to describing why we're dying from exposure to this particular the toxicity of this particular virus. Is there anything more you want to add to that?
Yeah, this is a really important mistake that we've again made in medicine. And if there's physicians and scientists and nurses listening to this, first of all, I want to just thank you for your effort. I know how exhausting it is to be in a hospital when there's a crisis at hand, especially when you feel poorly equipped for it and you feel like you can't help the patients that are coming to you who are suffering and dying, and you don't feel like you have the right tools. And so my hats are off to all of you who've been on the front line. It is exhausting. It is overwhelming emotionally. It is overwhelming physically. And you feel like, especially when there's a story of some deadly virus, you feel like you're putting yourself in harm's way and your family's in harm's way by being in those hospitals. So hats off to all of you who have been on those front lines. But what we saw, is going to take us, months and maybe years for us to really, seep into, because it's a devastating story that we created in Western medicine here, is that we reached 88% mortality rates in New York City, in the most, medically advanced society, apparently on earth. We created the highest mortality of any virus ever seen. Ebola has a mortality around 30%, and we hit 88% in our ICUs. Nowhere else in the world did we see that kind of mortality happen. And so why are people dying if Zack is right that this is just like some benign genetic update that we're supposed to get? Like, why are these people dying? If there's not enough genetic information in that virus to cause death, then what's causing the death? And so that took some research when this started happening. I was trying to figure out why this coronavirus, and what I found was that 2002 mimicked the exact same thing. And so SARS, it turns out, caused blue patients, hypoxic patients, that a few days later their lungs would fill with fluid, and then they would die of multi-organ failure in the weeks to come. And so that's exactly what was happening with these patients here in New York. And I didn't get that story until there was a nice Instagram post from one of the New York docs on the front lines, and he put together a beautiful story saying, we've got something wrong here. These aren't infections. These people are showing up hypoxic at levels they've never seen before and talking to me. They're not infected. They're not like acting septic, but they're hypoxic from the moment one. And then they get worse and worse over the days that follow, and respirators don't work. They seem to make it worse. You put them on a ventilator, they tank. And so he was just a call to act, for help. And so when I heard that they were turning blue, then we knew that, okay, they're showing up the same way SARS did, which was another coronavirus, and very similar to the current one. Then you look at 2012, MERS out of the Middle East, same pattern. And so we now can say, okay, there's a pattern that developed somewhere around, the 2000s, where coronaviruses, which has been with us since, 740 years ago, there was a very well documented coronavirus, situation. 1200 years ago, there's a suspected coronavirus situation. So, we've got a pattern of this virus for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then suddenly there's a change in its behavior, or our behavior around that virus in the late 90s or early 2000s. Excuse me. And what happened during that time was a ubiquitous introduction of a chemical into our food system through genetically modified crops, which was called glyphosate or Roundup. And that compound happens to block the production of some very specific amino acid building blocks for specific proteins. And one of the proteins that is very reliant on these essential amino acids that are disrupted by glyphosate happens to be a gene that builds our relationship to viruses. It's a gene that produces an enzyme that, like scissors, cuts up the DNA of viral genomics when they come into the cell, so that we don't overexpress this DNA. And so around the advent of glyphosate and Roundup, we see this event of an abnormal relationship built to this. I'm going to slide out of the sun while we're talking. And so an abnormal relationship is built to these as we lose the enzyme control mechanisms by which we stay in a balance with these. And so through chemicalization of our food system, we disrupt the homeostasis of this virus in our genome. And then around that same time, we see the explosion of air pollution in China. in particular, other cities around the world for sure, but China became our most toxic air polluted space in the world in the late 90s and leading up into the new century. And so by the time we're looking at 2006 and all that, you are getting pictures of Beijing where you can't even see the skyscrapers. It's just like buried in pollution. And it turns out that around that time, we were able to show that coronavirus and influenza bind to a carbon particulate in air pollution. It's called PM 2.5. Particulate matter 2.5 microns is a measurement of this tiny carbon particulate that can bind many things in the atmosphere, including things like cyanide. And so when you have viruses that are being produced and go aerosolized, as they should, they will bind and clump on PM 2.5. So now you don't have even distribution of genetic information. You have clumping of genetic information that's now tagged to go to the lung through the ACE2 receptor. And now you've got a delivery system for cyanide that's tagging that same PM 2.5. And it turns out that cyanide poisoning presents with hypoxia, blue patients, who a few days later will present with multi-organ failure and disseminated intravascular coagulation or blood clotting in tiny vessels, and they'll die of multi-organ failure. Cyanide poisoning has been a long-standing, story of how people would kill each other in the dark ages and everything else. We've known cyanide causes this thing that we call histotoxic hypoxia for hundreds of years. And so it turns out that as soon as that New York doctor, described what he was seeing, it was like, oh, that's histotoxic hypoxia that they're seeing. And then, I gave a few podcasts on that, trying to get the information out there so that people would start treating cyanide poisoning. So that's actually super easy to treat and almost free to treat. It costs like $10 for a cyanide poisoning packet. It's sodium nitrate and 2 other injections. You give those, and 3 minutes later, the patient should be reversing their cyanide poisoning. And so instead of a 3-month hospital stay, racking up millions of dollars of bills for these patients that are surviving COVID, a $10 package of cyanide kit should be able to reverse this whole process, because you change the shape of the hemoglobin that's been poisoned by the cyanide. Now, is it really cyanide? It could actually be a dozen at least other chemicals that are carried in high concentrations of air pollution. And so the virus is intended to enter the body through the ACE2 receptor into the bloodstream, but now it's tagged with all these kind of Trojan horse chemicals that we've produced in our energy and transportation sectors into the air. As we see PM 2.5 drop in China, as soon as everybody was pulled out of the streets, suddenly everybody stopped dying from coronavirus. It was like somebody threw a switch as soon as PM 2.5 went below 40 parts per cubic meter. And so it's very profound that it was not social distancing, it was not masks, it was the drop in air pollution that best matches this. The article out of Harvard that mapped air pollution quality in the areas of high mortality showed that for every 1 particle per cubic meter of PM 2.5, for every increase in that level by 1 microgram increase, there was a 10 to 15x risk of death. And so 1 extra particle, per this, cubic meter, and you have mortality increase. And so it would be impossible to find any other risk factor greater than that. And if we look across Europe, the most heavy PM 2.5 in the country is Northern Italy. Pockets in Germany, pockets in the UK, exactly where we saw it. Highest in the US, New York City, Louisiana, 4 corners of Colorado, out into parts of the Northwest. And so all the pockets of the highest mortality around the Western civilization occurred in these areas. Hubei province, highest concentrations of glyphosate and Roundup in the soils that would have disrupted our relationship through the genomic scissors no longer working, and the highest particulate matter of PM 2.5 in the world. And so Hubei province was where this thing had to begin, really, because we had created the environmental stress that would encourage the virus to occur in the first place. The virus, again, is an adaptation signal to the world saying, there is crisis, there is toxicity, there is need for change to happen genetically. Here's the genetic update. And then it gets tagged to PM 2.5 and can now travel the whole world attached to carbon particulate matter in abnormal clumps. And so we were set up with this kind of chemical toxicity that's now circulating around the planet to poison pockets that were predisposed. And those patients that died were cardiovascular patients, end-stage kidney patients, and diabetics. It took me a couple weeks to figure out why those three, because it should have been lung patients, right? It should have been COPD, emphysema, all of our typical risk factors for flu. In fact, it's a very simple solution in that those three conditions happen to have one unifying factor, which is they get put on the same two drugs. They all get put on a statin drug and an ACE inhibitor blood pressure medication, diabetics, cardiovascular, and kidney disease. Those two drugs upregulate the ACE2 receptor in the lung for this virus. And so through the pharmaceuticalization of our elderly, we create this incredible receptor device for abnormal toxic clumps of coronavirus, and then we vilify the virus for these patients dying not from infection, but from histotoxic hypoxia. 5,700 patients admitted to the hospitals in New York City were published in JAMA, and those 5,700 patients had no fever. Their average temperature was normal. Their average white blood cell count and their lymphocyte counts, normal, no signs of infection, and yet they were showing up blue, hypoxic, and with early organ failure, and days later would develop fluid in the lungs and secondary pneumonias in the hospitals, and then they would get the disseminated intravascular coagulation. They presented and died from histotoxic hypoxia that never got treated. And so there's a tragedy to the medical mind here in that we were told so much about this scary virus that it didn't let us think about the simple reality that was right in front of us, is these patients aren't presenting sick, they're presenting poisoned. And we just couldn't put those pieces together fast enough because we kept believing in this virus story.
Fascinating. Thank you. What I love so much about your discourses, whenever I've heard them, Zack, you always bring it back down to the most sacred, the sacrament of the relationship between man and nature, simply put. And that really is the restoration of sanity, the restoration of consciousness. It's all connected to that reclamation or restoration of that relationship between man and nature. Now, knowing what you know, and with your best doctoring hat on, what is the path of least resistance in your view to the restoration of this seminal relationship between man and nature? Is it a wholesale dissolution of the petrochemical industry and the agrochemical industry, for instance? Is it a complete revivification of our understanding of air, water, and so? I mean, what is the seminal piece that we're required to look at if we're to reclaim this seminal relationship between man and nature?
That's such a good question. I love that question. I've never been asked that. All these things that I do, it's so beautiful that nature has our template to a new humanity. It's not a new economy. It's not like a new philosophy of energy. It's a new humanity.